Hi, everyone. My name is Brianne Moy, and I'm glad to welcome you all to this next session of our Green New Deal discussion series. Um, Today, we will be talking about the Green New Deal and the pandemic crisis and thinking about the danger and opportunity that lies ahead as we work to respond to COVID-19 and how it's impacting our communities. But just before we get started with the program, I wanted to share that the Green New Deal discussion series has been bringing together activists, community leaders, policymakers, scientists, you name it, coming together to discuss what a Green New Deal could look like for Pittsburgh, for Southwestern PA. And ultimately, the idea behind creating this discussion series was that we'd be able to really draft policies that we can move forward with in implementing a Green New Deal in our home. And so today we're really excited to have speakers who are covering wide breadth of topics from transit to human rights and how we could use all these different ideas to think about a Green New Deal here. But before we get started, I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement and redlining acknowledgement. And I will start by saying we acknowledge that the land that we are occupying is stolen land. The land we currently call Pittsburgh was peopled by several native tribes, including the Seneca, Onondaga, Oneida, Lenape, Delaware, Shawnee, Seneca, and more that were displaced from other regions. We also acknowledge that this country was built by African peoples stolen from their land. It was their enslaved labor that enabled the growth of this country. Our more recent, deeply discriminatory collective actions, laws, and policies, such as redlining, forced evictions, and demolition of neighborhoods, have continued that legacy of exploitation and harm. It is only by acknowledging this reality that we can begin to make reparations. Land acknowledgement itself is a small gesture. It becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed actions. All right, and so before we go into our speakers for the evening, we wanted to set up today's discussion by first showing a video that was recently released by Naomi Klein, author of On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal, the book that we've been reading throughout this discussion series. But she created this video, which is only about 10 minutes long, to respond to the current crisis that we're living in. This video, I believe, is titled Coronavirus Capitalism. And for those who aren't too familiar with Naomi Klein's work, she's also very well known for her book, The Shock Doctrine, and talking about like the rise of disaster capitalism. And the central thesis of that book is that whenever disasters happen, whether they are natural disasters like huge hurricanes or maybe like a political crisis in terms of like leadership that might be overthrown. The capitalists or the ruling class takes those crises and is able to exploit them in ways that further entrench their power and help them push policies that ultimately serve to harm people like us. But Naomi Klein is telling us that in these moments of crisis, there's also opportunity for people on our side of the struggle to present our alternative for what we need to see happen and to continue to push and fight for that alternative to become our new reality. And this video that we're about to show is really centered on the fact that the coronavirus crisis, while we know we're just at the beginning of, and we recognize that it is going to bring great harm and devastation to so many communities that we work in, and of course, disproportionately Black and Brown communities, disproportionately poor communities across this globe. We also recognize that within this crisis, there is an opportunity for folks across, whether you want to call them progressives or liberal left, but there is an opportunity for us to put forth a vision and to really put great demands on folks in power in this moment. So when we come out on the other side of this crisis and the economic crisis that is also generated with it, we can come out stronger, and we can come out with just an economic system that doesn't rely on exploitation and the harm of us, but is actually like rooted in a regenerative economy and one that supports all people and takes care of the land. And so without any further ado, I will ask us to play this video.
Ideas that are lying around. Friedman, one of history's most extreme free market economists, was wrong about a whole lot, but he was right about that. In times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. But whose ideas? Sensible, fair ones, designed to keep as many people as possible safe, secure, and healthy? Or predatory ideas, designed to further enrich the already unimaginably wealthy while leaving the most vulnerable further exposed? The world economy is seizing up in the face of cascading shocks.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
In the wake of the coronavirus crisis, stocks have stopped trading on Wall Street after a 7% drop.
This is a historical day, the biggest drop we've seen since that crash in 1987.
The drop was spurred by a growing oil price war as the market was already weakened by coronavirus fears.
Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all.
In the midst of this widespread panic, corporate lobbyists of all stripes are, of course, dusting off all the ideas they had lying around. Trump is pushing a suspension of the payroll tax, which could bankrupt Social Security, providing the excuse to cut it or privatize it completely, an idea that has been lying around for a very long time.
A worker at his or her option ought to be allowed to put some of their own money in a private savings account.
Lying around on both sides of the aisle.
When I argued if we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid.
And then there are the ideas being floated to bail out some of the wealthiest and most polluting sectors in our economy.
We are working very closely with the cruise line industry, likewise with the airline industry. They're two great industries, and we'll be helping them through this patch.
Bailouts for fracking companies, not to mention cruise ships, airlines, and hotels, handouts which Trump could benefit from personally. Which is a big problem because the virus isn't the only crisis we face. There's also climate disruption, and these industries that are getting rescued with our money are the ones driving it. Trump has also been meeting with the private health insurers.
We're meeting with the top executives of the health insurance companies.
The very ones who have made sure that so many Americans can't afford the care they need. And what are the chances they don't have their hands out? It seems like the whole pandemic is getting outsourced.
Well, Mr. President, thank you for inviting us here today, along with our colleagues from Walmart and Walgreens and our partners at CVS. Normally, you'd view us as competitors, but today we're focused on a common competitor, and that's defeating the spread of the coronavirus.
The Fed's first move was to pump $1.5 trillion into the financial markets, with more undoubtedly on the way. But if you're a worker, especially a gig worker, there's a very good chance you're out of luck. If you do need to see a doctor for care, there's a good chance no one's going to help you pay if you aren't covered. And if you want to heed the public health warnings to stay home from work, there's also a chance that you won't get paid. Of course, you still need to pay your rent and all of your debts, medical, student credit card, mortgage. The results are predictable. Too many sick people have no choice but to go to work, which means more people contracting and spreading the virus. And without comprehensive bailouts for workers, we can expect more bankruptcies and more homelessness down the road. Look, we know this script. In 2008, the last time we had a global financial meltdown, the same kinds of bad ideas for no strings attached corporate bailouts carried the day. And regular people around the world paid the price. And even that was entirely predictable. 13 years ago, I wrote a book called The Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. It described a brutal and recurring tactic by right-wing governments. After a shocking event, a war, coup, terrorist attack, market crash, or natural disaster, They exploit the public's disorientation, suspend democracy, push through radical free market policies that enrich the 1% at the expense of the poor and middle class. But here is what my research has taught me. Shocks and crises don't always go the shock doctrine path. In fact, it's possible for crisis to catalyze a kind of evolutionary leap. Think of the 1930s, when the Great Depression led to the New Deal.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In the United States and elsewhere, governments began to weave a social safety net so that the next time there was a crash, there would be programs like Social Security to catch people.
The right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health.
Look, we know what Trump's plan is. A pandemic shock doctrine featuring all the most dangerous ideas lying around, from privatizing Social Security to locking down borders to caging even more migrants. Hell, he might even try canceling elections. But the end of this story hasn't been written yet. It is an election year, and social movements and insurgent politicians are already mobilized. And like in the 1930s, we have a whole bunch of other ideas lying around.
Do we believe that everybody should be entitled as a right to health care?
Yeah. We will not stop organizing and fighting until all unhoused folks who want shelter have shelter.
Canceling student debt.
It makes so much sense that if you're sick, that you should not be penalized where you don't have an income.
Many of these ideas were dismissed as too radical just a week ago. Now they're starting to seem like the only reasonable path to get out of this crisis and prevent future ones.
Now, here's something that helps explain the difference between the testing situation in South Korea and the U.S. The South Korea, like European countries and Canada, has universal single-payer insurance, and that means that it's easier to mobilize, and also people know what to do. There is pretty much one answer for how to get testing. The U.S. is a patchwork of countless different systems, and so you can't say, here's exactly the steps that every American should take in order to get tested.
And with Washington suddenly in the giant stimulus business, this is precisely the time for the stimulus that many of us have been talking about for years.
Today is the day that we truly embark on a comprehensive agenda of economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America.
It's called the Green New Deal. Instead of rescuing the dirty industries of the last century, we should be boosting the clean ones that will lead us into safety in the coming century. If there is one thing history teaches us, it's that moments of shock are profoundly volatile. We either lose a whole lot of ground, get fleeced by elites, and pay the price for decades, or we win progressive victories that seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. This is no time to lose our nerve. The future will be determined by whoever is willing to fight harder for the ideas they have lying around.
And so now it's time for the presentation part of the evening. And first up, we have a presentation by Jackie Smith. Jackie is the chair of Pittsburgh's Human Rights City Alliance. She is also a Pitt sociology professor, where her activism and research addresses relationships between economic globalization, social conflicts, and popular struggles. Jackie?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jackie Smith, and I work with the Human Rights City Alliance in Pittsburgh. And our organization is part of a national and global network of human rights advocates working to bring human rights home. what we are trying to do is to help people in our cities and communities use human rights as a framework for organizing around the different issues and struggles that we all face in our different cities. And what's really exciting is that in the last few years, we've been working more in concert with one another to share some of the ideas and lessons that we've learned from our work in different cities. And we're finding that we're fighting some of the same struggles, housing, the influence of corporations on development decisions in our cities, environmental challenges, pollution, etc. And so we're finding that we can learn a lot from one another and from human rights advocates around the world. And so that's the context from which I'm speaking. I work, I'm on the National Steering Committee for the U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance. And so working at the intersections of Pittsburgh and this national effort that's also connected globally. So what our movement here reflects is what Naomi Klein talks about as some of the ideas laying around, ideas that our social movements from, throughout history have generated from our the lessons from the struggles that we've been engaged with, from time immemorial throughout our history. So we're trying to build on these lessons and bring them together and build our power around these ideas. And human rights has emerged as an important framework because it's proved useful for bringing unity among diverse groups and for connecting national struggles with global ones. We're really part of a human rights globalization movement. And that's how I like to think about it. We're trying to counter the political project of economic globalization that's been so dominant and challenge it by saying we can organize our societies around the priority of human rights. So those are the ideas that we have laying around. We have some lessons from human rights movements about what are some of the tactics and strategies that we can use. And I'll share a few of those as we go forward. So we're really saying, what if our city was organized to put human rights and well-being of residents ahead of the goal of economic growth? And I think that question becomes particularly pertinent right now as we're looking at COVID-19 pandemic, and we're seeing quite clearly that a lot of our political leaders are really not used to thinking about human well-being in policy. They're very concerned about economic growth and treat that as a measure of human well-being when we're seeing that there really is not a connection between the health of the economy and the health of people and communities. So we have an opportunity here to try to reframe some of our political debate. And I think human rights can be a powerful tool for doing that. The way we've been trying to do that with the Human Rights Cities movement is to build diverse grassroots coalitions and to give people spaces to reimagine what would a human rights city look like and how do we get there? How can we work together across our differences to change institutions, to change policies, to change some of the cultures in our communities and realize that kind of a city. What human rights cities do that counters the project of economic globalization is that they help foster a recognition of place and our identity with our communities and our city and expand that connection beyond the people that we meet in our regular day-to-day lives and in our neighborhoods, and to extend that sense of place to include residents who we don't usually encounter and whose experiences we may not be familiar with. So human rights cities help share experiences across different groups so that we can understand our city as a very diverse place with lots of opportunities and potentials and people. And it makes us this commitment to place makes us ready to defend our our homes and our community and our ecosystems. It makes it harder for outside entities and corporations to come in and try to bring polluting development to our community. So this placemaking is really key to building a strong environmental movement. And another key lesson that comes out of our work is that one of the obstacles to achieving all of the different rights that people work on, from housing to education to labor rights, is that our political institutions have become in many ways very corrupted by a lot of the influence of money, corporations, and by years and years of atrophying of our citizenry. And so what we need to do is really democratize our local political institutions and mobilize more residents to be active defendants of human rights and bring human rights language into politics in a much more active and a proactive way. So that's kind of the overall goals of the Human Rights City movement. And like I said earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic is exposing some of the dangerous incompatibilities between the system that we have in place now, this capitalist globalization system, and human well-being and health. So I think to really use this opportunity, this moment now, to say, you all want to talk about the economy and getting the economy back on track. We want to center concerns about the health of people and put that conversation forward as the first one that has to happen right now. Certainly the economy is a part of that, but it's not the be-all, end-all as a lot of policymakers and corporate entities want to make it. So we want to center different priorities and goals and visions for how our communities could look and how our politics could look. So the other lesson that emerges from the work in Human Rights Cities is that we see that the capitalist system, as it operates, creates divisions and hierarchies among people. And then a big part of our work in the movements has to be to really target those divisions and work to build connections and unity in our communities, and to also build our collective capacity to defend our communities and to strengthen and sustain them, both in terms of our community, the relationships that we have with one another, and those are things that are destroyed through the regular operation of our growth-oriented economy. They're destroyed or atrophied at least, and our ecosystems. So we need to build communities and build unity among people in our city in order to do that. So one of the slogans that kind of orients our work is we want to challenge the dominant framework of politics, really try to change some of the scripts, which say that economic growth is what we need to prioritize. And once we get that, then we'll get human rights. We'll be able to have healthcare. We can have good schools. We can achieve human rights from growth. So rights are a byproduct of growth, and environmental protections likewise are seen as a byproduct of economic growth. But we say that human rights don't trickle down. They haven't historically. Why should we expect that to change? And so we need to rise up in order to demand human rights, but not just demand them, figure out how we're going to get there, to come up with strategies and recommendations for how we'll change the institutions that are in place so that they can serve our needs. And I think the Green New Deal really gives us some opportunities to think about what kind of system, what kinds of institutional arrangements could better do that than the ones we have. And again, I think the COVID-19 crisis really opens a space for us to really take the existing conversations around the Green New Deal and really fundamentally open them to some new kinds of possibilities. So I think now what we should be doing, and what the lesson of this pandemic, I think, is that we need to have economic and political systems that center and prioritize human health and well-being, and make that the priority, not economic growth. Like I said, we need resources, but we need a system that is oriented to put health and well-being first. And we see that the health and well-being of all of us is dependent on the health and well-being of all of us. So equity has to, again, be front and center in policy. And so I think that's a key demand and a feature of how we want to envision a Green New Deal. The other lesson that comes from the COVID-19 crisis is that we need to make sure that everyone has access to the basic needs that they need to survive. So we need food systems that are resilient, and that means that they have to be local and locally controlled. Right now, we have food in our supermarkets. We have some shortages, and depending on how long this goes, we could see that these globalized food systems that we have are not what we need to provide reliable, healthy food for people in our communities. And the best way we can ensure this is to localize our food system. That means that people in communities need to be able to control the use of the land in our communities. And so the Green New Deal has to involve discussions about land. And land extends, we need land to produce the things we need to survive, but we also need land to shelter us. And the need to shelter in place has highlighted for us, for many of us, the reality that many people don't have safe and secure places to live. And so I think that has to be a priority and really part of a Green New Deal that's about constructing healthy environments for our communities. The other kind of theme in a Green New Deal that's human rights centered is that the power needs to be centered in communities. It needs to be decentralized. And that's one of the things that I think our movements really need to make sure we keep in mind, that we don't need a Green New Deal that gives more power to centralized entities. We need to make sure that that there's a democratic process, that people and communities have control of the resources that they need, and they're involved in some of the decisions about how those are used. These decentralized structures are able to be more responsive to environmental cues and to the needs of the residents, and so that's going to be key. Finally, the Green New Deal should incorporate very consciously rights language, and not just human rights language. Our legal human rights tradition starts with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948. But at that time, people weren't thinking about the environment the way we do now. But movements today and human rights advocates today aren't wedded to the law, and we don't see human rights as really based in law. We see human rights as coming out of our movements and our struggles. And so we understand human rights as dependent upon rights for nature, and rights as extending to the rights of future generations. And so those ideas need to be brought into our thinking about the Green New Deal. Finally, one thing that the Human Rights Cities movement brings to our struggles is that it gives us leverage in the international system. There's a great deal of human rights language and law and standards and international resolutions that reinforce and lift up human rights and the need for climate justice. And those are things that we can appeal to and use to a much greater extent than movements in the United States do. We tend to think in this country, we have American exceptionalism. We think that the US, that human rights challenges happen out there. They happen in other countries. They don't happen within our borders. But those of us in doing this work know that there are plenty of places where we can improve human rights protections, especially in the area of social, economic, and cultural rights. And we have a lot of tools and allies internationally. In fact, I just got some emails today from people in Britain and Geneva asking about how we were doing here and how we were doing our organizing around COVID-19. So we have some international possibilities that we can use to strengthen our movements. So I don't want to go on too much longer, but I want to just share a little bit about what we're doing with the Human Rights City Alliance in Pittsburgh and how this connects with the work nationally and internationally. And what we've been doing in the last year or so is focusing on the United States. That right now is undergoing a human rights assessment in the United Nations. This is known as the Universal Periodic Review process that the United Nations does for every member government. Every 4.5 years, each government undergoes this review process. And what we've done at the National U.S. Human Rights Cities Alliance is create a campaign that we're calling the UPR Cities campaign. And what we've been doing is a series of webinars that we've been holding over the past year or so to help grassroots activists in different cities around the country use the UN UPR process to structure their own local human rights assessments in their communities and to bring the stories and reports that they build from their communities into the UN process. And there's a number of ways we do that. We submitted formal reports by the deadline that the UN had in October, this past October. And so on the Human Rights Cities, the US or the Pittsburgh Human Rights City Alliance website, you can find the report that we submitted from Pittsburgh, which centered the problem of racial inequity in our city as one of our primary concerns that we wanted the UN to address. And so at the national level, we have reports from several different cities. Washington, D.C. Did a report. New Orleans did a report. Our national report brought in input from the city of Atlanta, Chicago, and the Carolinas. We had a number of different voices brought into that national report. And so now what we're doing, and in fact, COVID-19 has given us 6 more months to work to try to lobby at the global level in Geneva at the United Nations to try to get other countries who will be conducting this review of the United States and making recommendations for what changes or what policies they want to see improvements on. And so we're using this time now to figure out what are some of the key priorities we have that we can see now that COVID-19 has exposed some of the real serious challenges and threats to well-being that we need to address most urgently. And so we'll be using this framework to try to push for other governments to really step up their pressure on the United States. And what I think is going to be clear as this pandemic plays out is that other countries of the world are going to realize that they really need to hold the United States government accountable to a much higher standard of human rights within our borders, because the lack of universal health care, we're among the worst in the rich countries for the right to health. And that has now become a threat to the entire world because we're not able to contain this pandemic the way we should be, given the resources that this rich country has. So I think we can really use this particular round of the human rights assessment in the UN to really bring some much firmer pressure from other governments and to build more of our international support network. So we'll be doing that over the next year. Folks in Pittsburgh, you'll be hearing some more about that and what we're doing with our report that we submitted to the UN. That report was focused on the national government and the recommendations we wanted to put to the national government. What we're doing now is working to build a local report. And so some of the community partners that have been involved in our local report, we're working to focus on what recommendations we have for city and county level government, and also for the institutions in our cities, so schools and universities. What are some changes that we think could be happening in our community at different levels that would improve our human rights performance going forward and make our city much more resilient and help protect the basic rights and capacities of residents to endure in challenging times like we're seeing today. So those are a few thoughts on strategies for thinking about the Green New Deal and possibilities for organizing. And I look forward to further conversations with you all and to see how this process unfolds. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jackie. And next up, we want to bring Laura Wiens. Laura is the director of Pittsburghers for Public Transit, which mobilizes transit riders and drivers for equity, access, and transparency within our public agencies. She's also a former labor organizer with Unite Here. Laura?
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you to Brianne and Jackie. The Naomi Klein video, too, was very informative and hopefully will help guide the rest of this discussion as well. So my name is Laura Wiens. I'm the executive director of Pittsburghers for Public Transit. So we are a grassroots transit riders union that works very closely with our brothers and sisters in the labor movement in Amalgamated Transit Union Local 85, which are the folks that keep our transit system running here in Allegheny County. And we believe that mobility and transit is a human right. And we believe that because in order for folks to access all of their basic needs, healthcare, jobs, food, and community, everything that folks need requires some way to get there. And for a lot of families, in fact, the vast majority of folks, particularly of color and low-income people in our urban areas, public transit is the way that they get around. And it's important that we are thinking about this not only in terms of equity for low-income communities and people of color, but also for our transit workers, who we believe are also experts in the system as much as our riders are. And collaboratively, we've found that riders and transit operators are able to push for improvements to the system that benefit everyone. Like they are fundamentally the groups of people that should be making the decisions for how our transit our investments in public transit should be spent, how our money, public tax dollars should be spent to ensure that we have the most effective and equitable system. And we also want to ensure that we're thinking about public transit in terms of its role in addressing the climate crisis. Transit right now, transportation emissions have over the last several years overtaken energy production as the single biggest contributor to climate change in the U.S., which is pretty astonishing. And we have a system in the U.S. of investing in road expansion, which It leads to further urban sprawl, which leads to greater urban segregation, and leads to a car-dependent culture. But dependency on cars is really costly for a number of reasons, not least of which is that it generates a massive amount of emissions leading to climate change and toxic fumes that affect the health and well-being of predominantly Black and Brown communities. And is also a major cost burden for many households. So in Allegheny County, we have an astonishing distinction in many of the municipalities where people are paying more for their sources of transportation than housing. It is the number one cost burden for households in many municipalities in Allegheny County. And that is very unusual that people would have to pay more. And it's not simply because housing is so cheap relative to people's income, but that transportation is so expensive. So giving people the ability to shift to using public transit is important for ensuring that they are able to have enough money to make other decisions, like being able to feed their families and, recreate or pay for, student loans or whatever else, all the other major expenses that households have. So there has been a lot of thought being given to what it looks like to have a Green New Deal that really centers a shift in how people get around, right? And particularly in our urban areas. And we believe, along with other national activists and advocates, that a Green New Deal means that by 2030, all Americans living in urban areas should have access, within walking distance to high quality, frequent transit. And that's actually not something that would be that hard to achieve. Because right now we are just disproportionately subsidizing at a federal level the expansion of roads and bridges at the expense of repairing the crumbling infrastructure that exists for our public transit systems and our existing roads and bridges. So if we were to instead put that money that we're putting towards growing our unnecessary sort of highway system, or the continuing to expand that system of encouraging people to live further and further out, to ensuring that everybody has the ability to walk and bike and take public transit in urban areas, that would be a much more effective use of public dollars and would lead to greater equity within our communities as well. And fortunately, unions like the Amalgamated Transit Union and the Transit Worker Union, the TWU, the Transportation Worker Union, have fought for decades to ensure that public transit jobs are really high quality, household sustaining jobs with good union benefits. And that is the kind of just transition position, right? That if we were dramatically expanding that workforce too, that those are the kinds of jobs we want to see members of our communities be able to access, away from extraction jobs and into jobs that also don't require more than a high school degree, but are incredibly skilled and provide an incredible and important service to our cities. So I think that and I'll just add also that a Green New Deal also thinks about and looks to the electrification of our bus fleets as well, to ensure that they're clean, that people that are waiting at the bus stops don't have to be concerned about harmful diesel exhaust fumes and the kind of health problems that they create. Same with the drivers. But that is not a substitute for a massive expansion of transit service, which is what we need to see as well. And that's what we would ask for in a Green New Deal. So this is, we are in a unique time, right? We're in a pandemic. We're seeing the collapse of our the capitalist economy in the U.S. and massive efforts and subsidies being provided to prop it up. And I think, Naomi Klein talks about the shock doctrine and that we're in a moment where everything is shifting, right? And things that were unfathomable a week ago are happening now, right? There's a week ago, the passage of universal basic income, the fact that our transit system is now a fare free transit system. In the midst of this crisis, people can get on and off our buses without paying their fare. That there are rent freezes and evictions freezes. There's talk about canceling student loan debt. These are things that, folks on the left have been fighting for, but we would never have imagined that even some people on the right would have championed some of these efforts. And universal health care is suddenly becoming incredibly reasonable, given the kind of impact that we see of folks not having access to the healthcare system to be able to test or treat the potential for them to have been infected with COVID-19. And so I'll just end by saying that we have a decision to make about how we take advantage of this moment. We know that the right is already taking advantage of it by trying to pass some seriously draconian social measures around and restrictions around abortion access, around criminalizing pipeline protests, around what I've been hearing is awful, but we're also winning, right? And I think if a Green New Deal is going to happen, it's going to happen on the heels of the kind of recession and the depression that we are likely to anticipate very soon. And so, we need to prepare our communities to be able to fight for the world we want to see, including a world where mobility and the right to the city is in fact a right.
Thank you, Laura. And then next we have Paul O'Hanlon. Paul is the chair of the City County Disability Task Force, Fair Housing Task Force, and he's also a neighborhood legal services housing attorney for 20 years. He works at the intersection of disability, poverty, housing, transportation, and voting rights. Paul?
Hi. So I want to talk about I think the biggest issue I want to talk about is housing, and sort of secondarily the relationship of housing and transit-oriented development, particularly as it impacts people with disabilities. And so and sort of tie that into the Green New Deal. And I want to start off by kind of differentiating what I see as being, on the one hand, the rhetorical elements of the campaign for the Green New Deal as it impacts housing, and then contrast that with some of the programmatic goals. I shouldn't say contrast it, but just sort of, note that one's more of a rhetorical and the other is more of a programmatic expression of that. And then lastly, the kind of, and lastly, I mean last in my presentation, but the third thing I want to kind of highlight is what I think is the clear inability of market capitalism today to build decent, affordable housing in places that people need, and that what you see is there's really a twofold dilemma, namely that number one is the price of housing, and number two is the price of land, and that the more desirable places to live, like with transit-oriented development and so forth, often the price of land pushes the cost to be unaffordable without subsidies. And again, it highlights the inability of standard market capitalism to do this. And I want to start off by also saying that people often talk about housing as if it's a sort of disembodied thing, when housing is often an abstraction or a placeholder for discussions about neighborhoods and communities. And that, we're not just talking about structures, we're talking about whole neighborhoods, whole communities where people live. And that, all of this relates to a whole range of individuals and, professionals, from financiers to developers to sources of subsidies. So let me start with what I see as sort of being the rhetorical campaigns around the Green New Deal as it relates to housing, and primarily that is the housing as a human right kind of claim. We're probably starting to become used to hearing about healthcare as a human right. And I think that we're gradually reaching the point where the majority of Americans are starting to entertain that, healthcare is and should be a human right. I get the sense that we're a bit further around housing. Nobody is really happy with homelessness, but I don't get the sense that most Americans are there yet with respect to housing as a human right. The second kind of rhetorical element I see in the Green New Deal campaign around housing is the campaign to what they call decarbonize housing. I think that what I saw were that in the United States, CO2 emissions, about 1/3 are from heating homes, and that you can see that there's actually a fairly large element of reducing our carbon footprint that involves decarbonizing housing. Things like insulation, cleaner forms of heating, renewables, et cetera, and then the third kind of rhetorical thing that is more of a campaign, but is to some extent rhetorical, is the whole notion of transit-oriented development. And so within those, I want to kind of talk briefly about what I see as being the programmatic elements of those rhetorical campaigns or demands. And in the area of housing as a human right and decarbonizing housing, there's a element of the Green New Deal that addresses the preservation of public and affordable housing as a critical element. And that when you look at, for example, public housing, which is a public asset, this is something that's really, in effect, already a federal responsibility. And so a big part of the Green New Deal around housing is to first focus on that element of our housing stock, which is already our responsibility, that we already have some duty to preserve, and to focus on the people who are the most in need to be the first priority for our efforts. And so therefore, it makes a whole lot of sense to focus on this campaign to decarbonize, preserve public and affordable housing. And that's a big part of the campaign. Now I should say that as I say this, that one thing that I'm not yet clear about is what the hell was in that $2 trillion federal stimulus package, and whether any of this is already funded or not, I don't know. All I know is that when I was reading everything I could about the Green New Deal with respect to housing, and then I heard about the stimulus package, I wonder if anything got into that, but I'm not sure how long it will be before we untangle everything there. I should just say I don't know yet whether there's anything in this bill currently that would fund this. And I wanted to share a slide from a presentation that highlights what I think is the obvious challenge we have to the area of housing and as it affects the Green New Deal. Now let me sort of, before I show the slide, I want to set this up by highlighting what I think is the one of the intersections between housing advocates and environmentally conscious people, and that is that the most the best thing that we, in my opinion, the best thing that we can do to reduce carbon emissions around housing is to preserve the housing we have. That we don't, there's generally no practical way that we reduce carbon emissions by allowing our housing stock to deteriorate and build new housing. And that even worse than that, the current housing stock that we all inherited, we were born, as a Pittsburgher, I was born after almost all of the housing in Pittsburgh was already built. So it's sort of like I inherited this natural resource that was built up by my ancestors, and that we quite literally could not afford to rebuild what we have. And so preservation, I think, is fundamentally critical, both from a sort of expense and affordability factor, but also from a sustainability factor, that we really need to be able to preserve and sustain the housing that we already have, and that our emphasis should not be on building new housing. Having said that, I want to show this slide and explain why I think it's important for us to kind of understand this data. Give me 1 second. All right. So this is a kind of a these are all numbers, and I want to kind of slowly walk you through what this slide talks about. So this slide looks, and this is basically Allegheny County, Pittsburgh specific. This was developed, I think Bob Damewood and Regional Housing with the, there were a few people who were involved in developing this data. But what it shows is the affordable and available units in our area for every 100 families. And I want to take you first to the very far right side of the graphics, where you see the numbers. And so on the very far right side looks at families where their income is less than 30% of median, which what we call extremely low income. And what we see is that for every 100 families in that category, there's only 38 affordable and available units that are available and affordable for families in that category. So if there's only 38 available for those 100 families, that means that roughly 62 families are forced to rent in the higher category than 30% of median, meaning they're paying more than what's affordable to them. And then if we look at the next category, we see that for families in the 30 to 50% median, that there's only 107 affordable and available units per 100 families. Now you might say, oh, okay, well then that category of folks should be fine. Well, they're not fine because 62 of the families in the poorer category were forced to rent probably in that category, meaning that instead of there being 117, we're now down to, maybe 50, something, in that category, which then pushes those 50 families up into the next category. So what you see is that there's this cumulative effect of bouncing people along this whole kind of sequence into more and more expensive housing than they can afford because of this severe lack of affordable housing in the lowest in the poorest category. And so, this is sort of, I think, a very kind of clear illustration how until we build a substantial amount of housing that's affordable to people in the extremely low income category, we're going to continue to see this bumping into a higher and higher category that affects not just those extremely low income families, but really has a ripple effect up the whole chain, forcing people to rent housing more expensive than they can really afford. And so what this says to me is that that the whole area of subsidized housing, and particularly deeply subsidized, affordable to the most low income and the poorest members of our community, are really what we need to focus on, because otherwise we're going to continue to see this bumping effect, forcing people into more and more unaffordable housing. Having kind of established, I guess, I think what I made the case for was that the area of our local housing market that's most in need of attention is in the category of the lowest, most least, the people who can least afford market housing, and so necessarily then we're looking at subsidizing housing. Because of that, because we're looking at subsidized housing as being our current priority, it then raises a whole range of issues around how we build affordable subsidized housing in neighborhoods. And a lot of neighborhoods are exploring things like land trusts, co-ops, and things that are either non-asset based housing or limited equity housing, or things that are somewhat less tied to the market than traditional housing that you see in neighborhoods today. I think that it's important for us to explore all these different models and what's going to really work, particularly in Pittsburgh. I think we have yet really to see, because many of these things are really in their kind of infancy, and we haven't yet built a whole lot of land trust based housing anywhere in the country. And to my knowledge, very little has happened yet in Pittsburgh. So one thing that I guess I have a concern about, though, is that as we move into exploring non-asset-based housing, and I hope everybody understands what I mean by that. But for example, if I think the most easy thing to understand is something that we call limited equity co-op, and that's where you essentially pay a fairly small amount, maybe like $2,000 or something, to buy into the co-op, and you become a member, and therefore you have the right to live there, and you pay your share of the expenses, and the neighborhood is in effect a community asset along with all the houses, and as a co-op member you have equal ownership of those assets, but it never really shows up in your checkbook. It never shows up in your bank account. It's not an asset that, for example, you're going to be able to tap into when you retire or things like that. And so I have a concern about us looking at limited asset solutions, because one of my priorities is eliminating the structural basis for poverty. And that what I see is that in our society, home ownership is the single greatest asset development tool that the average American has available to them. And that once we make that tool unavailable to low-income people, we necessarily create the basis for structural, ongoing reasons for poverty to perpetuate. And so, as a person who's worked in low-income housing my whole life, my interest is in looking at subsidies that allow people to basically be homeowners just like everyone else, to be able to afford affordable homes that they can maintain and be responsible for, and that it develops as an asset just like everyone else's does. And so, one of the models that I like to point to is the Section 8 home ownership program, because I think that it does those things. It essentially allows the housing to be a personal asset. It subsidizes the homeowner. And anybody who has a political reason to be opposed to subsidizing homeowners, just know that we subsidize virtually all homeowners. The real estate interest tax deduction is pretty much the biggest money giveaway that we have for housing in the federal government, and that it primarily benefits individuals with incomes over $100,000. So we already subsidize housing. We subsidize housing mostly for the wealthy, mostly in the suburbs. It's the suburbs that are the takers, not the city. And we really need to kind of re-educate everybody about the reality of housing subsidies, that it's not just the poor who are subsidized, and in fact the poor are subsidized at a rate much less than what we're subsidizing non-poor homeowners. So that's essentially, I think, the things that I wanted to raise in the discussion. The other thing I also just wanted to highlight, following the discussion about transit-oriented development, and I kind of alluded to this, is that people with disabilities have a tremendous need for affordable housing, but we also have a equally tremendous need for public transit. People with disabilities are the poorest group, poorest population in the United States, highest rate of poverty, highest rate of unemployment, and most dependent on public transit of all groups of people. And therefore, for us, transit-oriented development is a dream, to be able to live in an affordable house close to transit. And so I think that people with disabilities are certainly within the category of folks who see transit-oriented development as being a critical need and a something that I think that we're looking for a whole lot more of. But as I said, the biggest challenge with transit-oriented development is getting that development to actually serve the needs of the lowest income transit riders, because it's the very fact that it's development near transit, it's actually prime real estate, and that the challenge will be having that real estate go for affordable housing instead of some commercial development, which could certainly outbid affordable housing providers for that land. You know, being able to get expensive land for affordable housing is one of the big challenges, in addition to the sheer cost of housing. And the bottom line is that Americans have gradually lost the income that allows them to buy market rate housing. You know, in my lifetime, we've essentially had 40, 50 years of pay stagnation, which has left most of us unable to afford it. So this is sort of one of the larger failings of the sort of market capitalist model to be able to meet our needs, that it's just simply unaffordable, unprofitable to build housing that people need, and one of the bigger challenges that we face today. So thank you, and I think that that's it for me.
Thank you, Paul. And last but not least, I want to bring up Crystal Jennings. Crystal is a housing justice advocate with multiple groups, including the Penn Plaza Support and Action. She's currently the Stewardship and Community Engagement Manager for City of Bridges Community Land Trust, where she works to build diverse, equitable community ownership that preserves permanent affordability. Take it away, Crystal.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Jennings. I joined the team of City of Bridges Community Land Trust as the Stewardship and Engagement Manager. Start over. Ready? All right, Dan. Starting over. Hi, everybody. My name is Crystal Jennings. I joined the team of City of Bridges Community Land Trust as a Stewardship and Community Engagement Manager, where I work one-on-one with applicants while going through their home buying process. Community Land Trust creates affordable housing for low to moderate income residents, allowing them to build equity as homeowners. So now I'm going to go ahead and start at my presentation about what is Community Land Trust. So CLT 101, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, Community Land Trust. We are a unique approach to affordable housing home ownership, changing the structure of traditional home ownership. We exist to create permanently affordable home ownership to the individuals that are to low to moderate income residents. Next slide, please. We are a nonprofit, geographic-based organization. CLTs have been in existence for over 50 years, operating in 47 states, governed by a tripartite board of CLT residents, stakeholders, and practitioners. Over 13,000 units of CLT housing exist throughout the U.S. Next slide, please. How do we get to the ground lease? So we do separate leases. So there's one lease for the actual home itself, and then there's another lease for the actual land. So what we do is we separate the home ownership from the land and then from the improvements of the house. So the local COT retains the ownership of the land. Improvements of the home are owned by the individual. So what we do is we lease the land back to the homeowner. Next slide, please. Permanently affordable home ownership. COT homeowners sign a ground lease, and all the ground leases are approximately between $15 to $20 a month for the ground lease that we ask for. And they agree to share the future, they agree to share with future home buyers that keeps the house permanently affordable. And they agree to also resell to the resale formula that will be used to determine the price at which they can sell their homes for. So there is a max of how much they can receive when they resell the home to the next homeowner. Next slide, please. So the resale formula, the tool that allows COTs to maintain permanently affordable housing, allows the home ownership to build equity. Or resale formula is like major ground lease discussions, which chosen by the steering committee of the committee members can follow one of three options: a fixed rate of return, an indexed, and share appreciation. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of an example on how the resale formula is. So if you buy a house at $130,000, you put down $1,500 for a down payment, the reduction in the balance of the mortgage, and then the resale value grows at 1.15% annually. So in 5 years, the resale value will be $137,500. Equity built is $19,000 at the sale cost. So in 10 years, the resale value will be $145,500. The equity built will be $40,000 at the sale cost. Next slide, please. Comparison to a traditional home ownership. Key differences or restrictions on the use of the resale value. Purchase through a leasehold mortgage rather than fee simply mortgage. Key similarities: responsible for all the property taxes, eligible for all income tax benefits of traditional home ownership, and your family can fully inherit the property. Next slide, please. Post-purchase stewardship. So what makes us a little bit different than any other home buyer process is that you get a stewardship person attached to the house, which is me. So the COT lays out a clear explanation of the monitoring and enforces in compliance of the homes. You enter into a long-term, mutually accountable relationship with homeowners. So our houses or land is leased for 99 years. And when the 99 years is over, it can renew for another 99 years. So that makes it a total of 198-year lease. And we also stand behind you and we back you up to ensure success. So example, like right now we're going through the coronavirus pandemic. So what we have done is we've been giving our families resources and connecting them to resources that can help them in their time of need in regards to, their mortgage that they have, connecting them to the banks and finding other tools that they can use to help them in their time of need. If there is a problem with the taxes, they don't seem right, we actually accompany you and help you with the lawyer fees and showing up to support you and be there with you when you have to go to court and things like that. Next slide, please. Home ownership security. So over 90% of COT homeowners remain in their homes at least 5 years. Historically, the average of COT home ownership is about approximately 7 years. Over 70% of COT homeowners, when they resell their homes, purchase an restricted market rate home. So basically, buying a COT home is like a starter home. It's mainly for a lot of people that can't afford a normal market rate home. So you purchase a CLT home, you build some equity and some wealth. So then when you resell your home, you use that money that you put into all your mortgages, you get all that back. Use that money to purchase a market rate home if you choose to for your family, if you grow. Next slide, please. COT mortgage performance. So this is a little old. But this is from between 2008, 2009, and 2010 foreclosure proceedings. So you can see those numbers right there and the differences. Next slide, please. So our story for City of Bridges. Next slide, please. So this City of Bridges Community Land Trust was created in Lawrenceville Corporation, and you see the amount of people that started in the steering committee, and you see the real estate development strategy, those companies, the community engagement, the permanent financial person, and then the regional data hub. Next slide, please. So this is a little small, and I'll end up reading you our vision and mission. But this is a little bit of the work that we have created. It basically states who we are, our vision, our mission, our values, and the work that we do. Next slide, please. So the national models, there are a lot, like I said earlier, but these are the ones that we follow and look up to. So there's Proud Ground, which is in Portland, Oregon. They are 5 counties wide, and the areas that they serve, and there are 280 homes in that area. There's also a big one in Minneapolis. They are called City of Lakes. They serve the entire city of Minneapolis. They have over 275 homes. Then there's also Burlington, Vermont. Their range is from 3 county service areas, and they have 620 single family homes and 2,300 rental units. So they're definitely another organization that we are looking to as one of our models here in the city of Pittsburgh. Next slide, please. So national research findings of CLTs is growing geographic service areas, dedicated stewardship staff, which is me, home ownership advisory committees, which is really, really good. So these are the areas where we found that in order to make a CLT community land trust work in certain regions, areas, communities, cities, these are the things that you need to have. Guarantee governance by CLT residents, a diverse portfolio, and a robust partnership. So these are all the things that nationally we have found to make CLTs work. Next slide, please. So CLT governance structure is 1/3 of community members of the geographic served area by CLT. Another is 1/3 of CLT residents. So that is our homeowners that live in our CLT homes be able to sit on a board. And then another 1/3 is the experts, the people that are able to give a good input and understand a little bit of this better. So that's our structure of 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. Next slide, please. Onboarding. So the onboarding part is invitation to do CLT and values alignment plus need. So the need is the community plan that calls for the permanent affordability. So we only enter into communities that we are invited into. You will not see us just show up and telling you what you and your community need. We only show up when we're invited and we're willing to work and sit down with people to, one, listen to their need of what they want in their community. So existing community uses to be preserved. The demand, real estate transaction data, the location access of opportunity, and existing market study. So the scale is what's available, what apartments and properties are available, homes that are available in your area. The investment, interest from funders, access to public sources, other assets, and contributions. Capacity is existing neighborhood organizations. So like that can be other organizations that reach out to me, say, hey, Crystal, we're interested in what CLT can bring to our communities. And I'm from whatever organization. And then their track record of development. How many properties do you guys already own? Or do you own a parcel of land? Things like that. And the community process that is in place for this. So we end up doing, after we sit down with the person who invited us into the community. We start a community process. We have community meetings teaching them how CLTs work, how this could look for their community, and basically get some input on that. Next slide, please. So community control through community leadership. So for this, blow it up on my side. So this is the CLT Board of Directors. So this is just like the graph of how everything goes down and the leadership of it. I'm not going to go through all of that because it's small on my end, but you can see how it kind of structures down from the top to bottom. Thank you. Next slide. So this is a picture of one of our houses that we built from the ground up. And here is where I said I would let you guys know what our vision and mission is. So we put vision first because this is most important to us. City of Bridges Community Land Trust envisions diverse communities where people thrive, build wealth, establish roots, and foster community ties without the risk of displacement. Our mission is we build community ownership that preserves permanently affordability, empowers individuals, and ensures responsibility, growth, and stewardship. Thank you. Next slide. So if you have any questions, this is where I'll leave it open for questions. If you have any questions on how CLTs can be beneficial to your community, if you're interested, please reach out to me, Crystal Jennings, at cityofbridgesclt.org, or you can call us at 412-621-1811, and my extension is 110. And the reason why I think that CLTs is really good for there to be a start of a Green New Deal is that, again, this is something that is needed here now, definitely what we're going through, that can allow people that normally cannot afford market rate housing, but want to start something small. This is something that you can pass on to your kids, your grandkids, and keep it going down. This is a way that they can build security and equity and still be able to have something that they can call theirs. And then when they do decide to move, if they decide to move, because you don't have to, 99-year lease, you're able to use the money that you have put into a CLT home to use that to purchase a market rate home if you choose to, because some people do grow out of the CLT homes. But if you're interested, I definitely believe this is a great, great new start for a Green New Deal. This should be in the documentation of that, and this should be worldwide, community-wide, statewide, citywide. In order for this Green New Deal to work, we have to be able to use everybody, and that means people that have been excluded from before the first Green New Deal. We need to be able to contact Black and brown people, indigenous people, people that have wealth and can provide expertise to this Green New Deal. A lot of people need to understand like why we are where we're at in our lives and in this world, and why people don't take us or take what we do as importance, because it's been written in legislation to not like care about us, like put us in the slumps, put us in the projects, don't pay us what our counterparts is getting paid. Like it's deep. It's really, really deep. Okay, so what I just sent you is a video titled Segregation by Design. The video talks a little bit about why Black and brown people have been placed in a predicament in our lives and in this world, how far back it goes. They talk about redlining, they talk about segregation, they talk about them tearing down houses to build highways, and why they put all of us into a project area or a segregated area to keep us all together. And they took away our schools, they took away resources for us to live. So where we had to throw trash outside, and they stopped trash pickup. They removed grocery stores from away from us. They closed libraries. So they took us to where we can't educate ourselves. We can't provide for our families, provide for ourselves. So just know that we have not gotten here by choice. We have been placed into a lot of predicaments that we deal with right now in 2020. And this all started way back when when legislations were signed by presidents and other people of power, which is called the white man. So just if you get a chance, please look for segregatedbydesign.com is actually the website. Segregatedbydesign.com. And please watch the video. It's about 20 minutes or so. And it's very deep and very powerful. And if you can, please share with everybody so they can understand why we have been placed where we're at today and where it came from.
Thank you, Crystal. Well, that brings us to the end of section 6 of our Green New Deal discussion series. Once again, just want to say thank you to Jackie, Laura, Paul, and Crystal for taking the time to join us for this evening. All right, and before we wrap for the evening, I'm just going to toss it to Helen. She just has some brief updates about where the Green New Deal discussion series is headed. Helen?
So the Green New Deal discussion series will be returning to an interactive format on Sunday, April the 19th. We will be using a Zoom platform thanks to Maren Cook, who has the version of Zoom that will host up to 100 people. So we will have presenters that will be talking about movement building, and I can't imagine a more critical issue right now. Even as we are stuck in our rooms, we need to be reaching out to each other and pushing harder than ever to address the systemic, the deep systemic, sorry, I lost it. 1 second. Hey, Paul, yeah. I'm on recording. Could you just hang downstairs for a few minutes? Thank you. Okay, should I just start from the top, Dane? Okay. So thank you again for listening to this recorded session. We will be returning to an interactive format on Sunday, April the 19th. Our Green New Deal fellow organizer, Maren Cook, is allowing us to use her Zoom platform, which can host up to 100 people. So there will be various leaders, including Brianne. She's one of the local environmental justice leaders who will be speaking about their work to build movements behind the environmental justice platform that is so well embodied by the overall framework of the Green New Deal that Naomi Klein talks about, and that we are trying to bring into specific reality right here in our own specific geography, ecology, and set of human relationships. So you will be able to comment, to ask questions of the speakers, and we can again start to brainstorm the kinds of changes we need to see right here in Southwestern PA. So thank you so much. We will be sending out a mass email. We will have this on Facebook with instructions on how to connect with us on Zoom. We're not going to broadcast the link because that could allow Zoom bombing. But if you are part of our list, we will welcome you to be part of that discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Helen. And so, folks, that brings us to the end of this session of the Green New Deal discussion series. We look forward to chatting with you on Sunday, April 19th.